God's righteous judgment. You therefore have no excuse, you who pass judgment on someone else, for whatever point you judge the other. You are condemning yourself, because you who pass judgment do the same things. Now we know that God's judgment against those who do such things is based on truth. So when you, a mere man, pass judgment on them and yet do the same things, do you think you will escape God's judgment? Or do you show contempt for the riches of his kindness, tolerance, and patience, not realizing that God's kindness leads you towards repentance? But because of your stubbornness and your unrepentant hearts, you are storing up wrath against yourself for the day of God's wrath, when his righteous judgment, will be revealed. God will receive to each person according to what he has done. To those who by persistence in doing God seek glory, honor, and immortality, he will give eternal life. But for those who are self-seeking and who reject the truth and follow evil, there will be wrath and anger. There will be trouble and distress for every human being who does evil. First for the Jew, then for the Gentile. But glory, honor, and peace for everyone who does good. First for the Jew, then for the Gentile, for God does not show favoritism. This is the word of God for the people of God, by the way.
I want to thank Leslie. I never mentioned it. Thank you for filling in today. Otherwise, it's going to be me. And Dean, as usual, thank you. That's it, guys. We don't have any more songs to play. Yeah, you're done. Unless you want to preach.
That's okay.
All right. Thank you. You can join the congregation. I will need your help later, though. I told you we're doing this by the seat of our pants. Armona sent me a list and said, do this. And I'm being pliable, disregarded most of it, and did what I wanted. If you have your Bibles, and I hope you do, let's turn to Romans chapter 2 this morning. Without a shadow of a doubt, Romans is probably the most important book in Scripture. It is the Magna Carta of the Christian faith. It's the Christian constitution. Martin Luther made a statement about Romans. He said, if we had no other book but Romans, we would have everything that we need for salvation. Over 500 years ago, this simple epistle set the world on fire. And here we are over 500 years later, still benefiting from the impacts of the Great Reformation. I personally have had an opportunity to probably preach or teach through Romans probably 6 times, half a dozen at least. And except for the first one where I thought I knew everything, everyone after that I approached Romans with just a little bit of fear and trepidation, because I have never finished a study of Romans where God has not taught me something about myself or about him. The last time I taught through Romans was here at First Covenant Sunday School class, and it ended up taking me to a place that I said I would never go to, into a building that I said I would never step foot into, and people that I told myself I would never talk to again. And when I got to Romans chapter 2, for the first time in my life, God told me what biblical forgiveness was. And it ended up being something that not only did he instill in me the understanding of it, but I didn't realize how much I was going to do in the next 3 to 5 years of my life. You might not realize this, but there's really 2 types of forgiveness that's mentioned in Scripture. The first is vertical, and the second is horizontal. Vertical forgiveness, we have a pretty good grasp on. That's God's forgiveness of us. Horizontal is more complicated. Horizontal is when we forgive others. And half of that we understand. We believe that people should forgive us. The other half becomes more convoluted. It's when we have to choose to forgive others. And you might not realize it, but the first example of forgiveness in Scripture is not vertical, but it's horizontal. When you get to the end of Genesis, Joseph's brothers will come to him and ask for his forgiveness. And even though Joseph doesn't verbalize the forgiveness, his actions speak volumes. He will take his brothers in his arms, and he will greet them, he will cry, and he'll make the famous statement that my brothers intended it for evil, but God intended it for good. And even culture kind of messes up the idea of forgiveness. in my lifetime, and I've heard two different theories when it comes to people and forgiveness. The first one, they say, well, if you haven't forgotten, you haven't forgiven. Well, not only is that not biblical, that's not even true. Forgiveness for me as an individual is a day-by-day, hour-by-hour, sometimes even minute-by-minute type of thing. And I will go along and do really well on people that I have chosen to forgive. And then all of a sudden something will happen and my brain will go back to the past. And I'll start rehashing things. And my wife can tell you this. And I will get upset and I'll have to take a deep breath and I'll have to remind myself again that I have a responsibility to forgive. The second theory that people, it's kind of a new one. It's just been in the last 10 years. A lot of this came about because of the Me Too generation. But the idea was, well, if there's no justice, then there shouldn't be any forgiveness. If the person doesn't admit their fault, then there shouldn't be any forgiveness. And that view isn't even biblical. Because sometimes it's not possible for a person to admit their fault. Maybe the perpetrator who hurt your feelings or destroyed your life, maybe they've passed on. Maybe it was a parent that you have not been able to forgive. And to be honest with you, forgiveness is not based on how that person responds. Forgiveness is based for you. And the thing I had to learn the most when it came to forgiveness is that when I chose to hold on to the bitterness, what I truly was doing was shackling myself to that person. One of my favorite Christmas stories, and people in Sunday school class know this, but A Christmas Carol, Charles Dickens. Every year, I don't have a lot of traditions when it comes to Christmas, but every year I try and watch a different version of A Christmas Carol. And one of my favorite scenes is when his business partner, Marley, comes back to him carrying the chains that he drug through life. Well, that's what happens with unforgiveness. When we choose not to forgive, we shackle ourselves to the past. And we shackle ourselves to that one individual, and then the next time somebody hurts us, what we do is we shackle ourselves to that individual, and then all of a sudden, anything that happens that reminds us of the past, we drag our chains. And that person is constantly going with us. And because of events in my life, I had reached a point where I realized that I had shackles that had been built up. And as I was sitting here studying through Romans, I got to chapter 2. And I realized for the first time in my life why I had to forgive. Now, bear with me for a moment. I want to give you a quick synopsis on Romans so you understand why chapter 2 is so important. And what makes Romans unique from all of Paul's writings is this is the only letter, the only epistle that he wrote that he never met anybody. In fact, to this day, we don't know how the church in Rome started. Our best guess is that the church in Rome started because of the day of Pentecost, and somebody heard the message from Peter and John, and they took the message back to Rome. And Paul writes this letter to the church in Rome saying, I want to come see you, I want to come visit. And we know that he made it there. And he starts out the first chapter, and he introduces himself. He says who he is. He says, I am Paul, the apostle of Jesus Christ, a bondservant. And he goes through the first half of chapter 1, and he tells them who he is and what he wants to do. He says, I'm coming to preach to you a universal gospel. I'm not preaching to the Jew, I'm not preaching to the Gentile, I'm preaching to all. And he makes this famous statement, probably the most popular, the most famous statement that Paul ever writes in verse 16 of chapter 1. He says, For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith. And it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. And in those simple verses, he sums up what the gospel is and what he wants to do. But then he goes down to verse 17, and he starts a legal defense on why we need salvation. And he'll start out with a simple event. He says, the wrath of God is revealed. And from the end of chapter 1 through chapter 3, he will give us an example of why God's angry at us. And to be honest with you, I had grown up in a home where I have really good parents. My dad to this day is still one of my heroes. And I think he's a great man who came from a tough background and overcame so many obstacles. And to this day, he's still one of my heroes. And I just thought, since I grew up in a great home and I grew up with great parents, and my little brother was weird, but that was another issue. My family was perfect until I was about 3 and a half. And then he came into it. And it's been downhill ever since. But I thought that I was just kind of a step above. And it never crossed my mind that God had been angry at me. That he was wrathful with me. And Paul will give 3 examples of why we are under the wrath of God. And for the rest of chapter 1, he'll describe what I refer to as the pagan. And this is the person who, even though they had never heard the gospel, they knew the truth. Because you might not realize it, but every person ever born on this planet, in their heart, they know there's a God. And they know there's truth. And instead of accepting the truth, they exchanged it for a lie. And what they did is they started making religions in their mindset. And they made gods out of wood and stone and rock. Anything they could come up with. And sometimes their religion was their intellect. What they thought was right. And if you finish up the last part of chapter 1, you find out that he gives an example that God just eventually just let them do what they wanted. He turned them over to their own mindset. And he lists all the sins that are accomplished through that. And if you read that, you'll find out it sounds a whole lot like our culture today. But then he goes to chapter 3, and he introduces the Jew. And he states to the Jew, he says, of all the people that I created, you are the most guilty. Because you knew who God was. You had the truth, and you chose to reject it. It's kind of interesting. You might not realize it, but I'm very proud of my wife. If I don't say that enough, I apologize to her. But here back in September, she went back to school. She's now working on her 2nd master's degree. She's smarter than I am in children and youth ministry. And I remember it's made me have to dig out some brain cells that I haven't had to use for a while. Because we'll be sitting in the living room and she'll say, what about this? Or what about this? You know, when I went to college the first time, you know, my Google search engine was a card file in the library. You know, you got a big 7-foot library table and you stuck the books out there. And everything you needed, you reached for one, you got another one, and went that way. Now here she goes, starts school, and she downloads this program that has everything about my library on it. And with the touch of her finger, she can bring everything up. And I think about that, when we talk about the Jews and knowing all the truth, is that we as a Christian culture today are extremely guilty. We have knowledge at our fingertips. I know most of you probably here today are reading the Bible on your phone. And from a pastoral perspective, I don't like that. Because there's nothing more encouraging to a pastor than to hear the flipping of rice pages as they follow along. And you don't get that with a cell phone. But I realized that I had been blessed into a family, and God's wrath was upon me because I had the knowledge. But then I got to chapter 2. And in chapter 2, he refers to what theologians call the moral man. And that's the man who thought that because of his behavior, that he was worthy of God's grace. He was worthy of God's love. And he looked down upon it. Basically, he did this. He did a comparison. He says, God, I have done this, 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 and this for you. And compared to him, I'm a pretty good guy. And for the first time in my life, I realized that the standard was not me. The standard was God. And when it came to God's standard, I had fallen short. And once I started to understand that, then he started to open my eyes to why I needed to forgive. And he also introduced me to the fact that my religion and my faith, the level of my faith was directly related to my level of forgiveness. If I said I had faith, but I wasn't choosing to forgive, then basically I was a liar. And this is what he said in chapter 2. Sorry guys, I gotta take a drink. Starts out in verse 1, chapter 2. He says, therefore, you have no excuse, O man. Every one of you who judges, or in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself, because you, the judge, practice the very same thing. We know that the judgment of God rightly falls on those who practice such things. Well, all of a sudden I realized that in all my bitterness and anger, and the past that I was holding on to, I realized that I had become the judge. And by being the judge, we talked about this in Sunday school, by being the judge, I was putting sin into categories. And we do that from a human standpoint because it makes it easier for us to digest fault. And we have this opinion that this sin is greater than this sin. The sin of adultery is greater than the sin of gluttony. The sin of pride is greater than the sin of gossip. And then I added to it and I said, well, what they did to me was a greater sin than what I have done to God. And all of a sudden I read this section and he stopped right there. And he said, this is what played through my head, honestly. Believe me, man, this is what he said to me. No. He said, do you think that your sin is less than their sin? And for the first time in my life, I had to honestly look at God and say, no. Sin in God's eyes is the same. Now you could say that there are different consequences for sin. Committing adultery in the family has a greater effect than possibly going to Pizza Ranch and overeating. But they're both sins. You could say that the sin of pride is greater than the sin of gossip, but they're still sin. They might have bigger consequences, but they're still sin. And I had to honestly look at God and say the first step in me being able to forgive was to realize that I as an individual was a sinner. That I had sinned against the one that mattered the most, and that was God. And even though those people had sinned against me, they still were sinners. And so by realizing my own personal sin allowed me to take the first step in forgiveness. And that's where everybody starts. You have to be able to acknowledge your personal sinfulness before a righteous and holy God, before you are capable of forgiving somebody else. And so I stopped there, and then I got to the next verse. And he starts out, he says, do you suppose, O man, you who judge those who practice such things, and yet do them yourself, basically sin, doesn't matter what it is, he says, that you will escape the judgment of God? Or do you presume on the riches of his kindness and the forbearance and patience, not knowing that God's kindness is meant to lead you to repentance? But because of your hard and impetuous heart, you're storing up wrath for yourself on the day of wrath, when God's righteous judgment will be revealed. There used to be a verse in 1 John, well, there still is a verse in 1 John. But basically it stated that if you can't forgive your brother, you can't forgive yourself. Or God can't forgive you. And I hated that verse. It was one that I thought, well, if I just take a pair of scissors and I cut it out, then I don't have to worry about it. Because I didn't understand. So that means that since I can't forgive these people, then that means that somehow God's not forgiving me. And I had to sit down and really think about that. And it wasn't that God wasn't forgiving me, but because of my bitterness and my hard heart, I wasn't allowed to feel God's forgiveness. Because I had put up a shell. And I had surrounded myself with anger and hurt and bitterness, and I wasn't able to feel. And then God looked at me, and literally the conversation going, he said, do you think I love those people as much as I love you? And I was honest. I said, no, I don't think you do. Because you don't know what they did to me. He says, do you think that there are greater sinners than you are? And I said, yes, I think there are greater sinners than I am. And all of a sudden I realized what a hypocrite I was being. And I realized that for me to forgive people, I had to love people the way God loves people. And I had to see them the way God sees them. And I realized for the first time in my life that I wasn't deserving of God's forgiveness. That I had sinned against him in every way imaginable. And by holding on to my bitterness and my anger, that I was just compounding the problem. And I had shackled myself to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 people in my past. And every time something came up that reminded me of my past, guess what I would do? I would shackle myself again. And sitting alone in my apartment, going through a very difficult time in my life, and sitting alone, I said, I have to go to the north. I have to do something. I have to follow through. And I dwelt on this for a month. And finally, I just broke down. I took some vacation time, and I pointed my vehicle towards Bacchus, Minnesota. It was the last church that I had pastored. And I left there under very difficult circumstances with my spirit just broken. I was hurt. And I had blamed everything on them. And I was young, I was immature, I was stupid, I was prideful. And all of a sudden I realized that for me to move forward, I had to put into practice the things that God was teaching me. And I drove up to Minnesota, 6-hour drive, the whole time trying to think, is there any way I can get out of this? I said, there's people that I have to visit with. And the first person on my list was a man by the name of Rick, and he'd been the board chairman. And Rick is a very talented individual. He's a business owner, very successful. And I literally drove by his shop 10 times. I would drive and come back, and I'd drive and come back. Finally, I pulled in the parking lot. I walked in the door, and he was sitting in his office. And I said, Rick, can we visit? And he had no idea. It'd been almost 15 years since I'd seen him. And we sat down, and once he finally realized who I was, this fear came into his eyes. It literally broke my heart. And I said, Rick, I'm just coming here because I have to ask your forgiveness for what happened. I said, I've been holding on to bitterness and anger and hurt for 15 years, and I have to do something about it. And this big, burly, northern Minnesota man with a flannel shirt and blue jeans started to cry behind the table. And he looked at me and he said, I'm so sorry for what happened. And you know what I found out? That by me releasing Rick allowed me to see him the way God sees him. And I realized that he was a hurting individual that needed my love and my salvation. And he needed my forgiveness. And I spent the next 3 days going around to individuals that I needed to restore a relationship with. And I had served as president of a Bible camp up north. And the director of the Bible camp was one of my very best friends, and we left on very bad terms. And I drove into the camp that day, hoping that he would be gone. And I walked into the cafeteria, the mess hall, about the size of the sanctuary, and he was at the end of it, and I walked in, and he literally ran across the sanctuary. He gave me a hug. And my heart broke. Because I realized what God feels like when a sinner repents and comes to him. And I realized that all of a sudden I'm understanding how God views me and how he views my sin and how I broke his heart. And Doug and I spent the rest of the day talking about the past and talking about the future and talking about the things that had taken place. And he looked at me and says, you know how important your ministry was to us? And he took me around the camp and he showed me things that I had left a footprint on. And I was just like overwhelmed about all this. And people came into the camp that I hadn't seen in 15 years and they were talking about the imprint. And I had lost all of that because for 15 years I had held on to anger and bitterness. And I had missed out on the blessing. And that Sunday morning, I decided to return to the place that I said I would never go back to. And I walked into the church that I had pastored. And instead of having bitter and anger, I was greeted the same way. And the current pastor at that time stood up and he says, and he pointed me out. I didn't even know he knew me. I'd never met the guy. And he pointed me out and he thanked me for the impact and the footprint I had left in the church. And I just started crying. Because I understood how God had felt about me. And how important that it was for me to forgive these people. And I realized that by forgiving them, they needed forgiveness. And I walked out that door at that moment, and my life was still in a shambles. I was still in a mess. I was still struggling. But I walked out that door understanding that my spirit was free. And I got down to the next part of Romans. He says, verse 8, He says, he will render to each according to his works, to those who by patient and well-doing seek for glory and honor and immortality. He will give eternal life. But for those who are self-seeking and do not obey the truth, but obey unrighteousness, there will be wrath and fury. There will be tribulation and distress for every human being who does evil, the Jew first and also the Greek. But glory and honor and peace for everyone who does good, the Jew first and also the Greek, for God shows no partiality. I found out, number one, that I had to acknowledge it. I had to. Number two, I had to take the time and see people the way God saw them. And to see that they were just hurting sinners. And they had a friend who used to always tell me, he said, Tim, he says, hurting people hurt people. I didn't believe it, but now it's gospel. But then I found out, I reached the last, I said, by forgiving people, I can bring about their salvation. Because they were looking for something. And they needed something. And even though I thought that I was insignificant, they needed my forgiveness so that they could move on. And by forgiving individuals and forgiving people, we open the door for them to see the love of God and to see Christ in a new way. I had become so angry and bitter, and I had lost the understanding of forgiveness. I had forgotten how important that gift is to other people. And I found out that I couldn't show partiality for it. I couldn't look at one individual and say, well, I don't like them, but this person I kind of like, so I'll forgive them and I'll not forgive this. I found it was all the same. And for the first time in my life, instead of seeing the anger of the individual, I saw the sin behind them. And I realized that their sin had caused this problem, but I still had to love the individual. And all of a sudden, I had some principles that started to go through my life that I have put together so that when this happens now, I'm able to forgive. And I can go through, I could list for you people that have hurt my heart. And it wouldn't matter to you. I was sharing with Dean and Julie a situation that happened to me last week. And part of me stood up and said, justice. But then I realized that I had forgiven. And my heart wept for them. Because I realized that they were dealing with the consequences of their own sin. And I hurt for them. And I felt bad for them. And I just sat there and I said, 2, 3, 4 years ago, I would have been dancing on their grave. And now I'm rejoicing and feeling bad for their sin. And that's the way the Christian life should be. So I came up with some principles, and all mine, the things that I've read. And when it comes to forgiveness, these are steps that I first of all, categorizing sin, I try not to do it anymore. I'd like to tell you that I don't do it, I try not to do that. I try and see people the way God sees them, as sinners needing salvation. And I remind myself that if I'm going to forgive somebody, it might be the first step towards their salvation. Because they understand they need forgiveness. But I also told myself that when I'm offended and I'm hurt, that I name the fault honestly. Whenever we get hurt, it's human nature. What we do is that we embellish the story. Now, my family would tell you that I'm great at embellishing. And there's the truth in there somewhere. I just like to add to it. It makes the story more colorful. But when it comes to hurt, you have to name it honestly. You can't embellish it. And what we have a tendency to do when we get hurt and offended, we start putting motives behind it. And then we start saying, well, it's because of this, or it's because of this. And to be honest with you, most people who've hurt you have never done it out of a malicious heart. In fact, most people who hurt you don't even realize they've done it. And so you have to name it honestly. You have to say, this is what happened, and I choose to forgive this. And I'm going to move forward. The second thing is, you have to realize that they're fellow humans. Nobody in this room is perfect. There was only one. Denise made the comment about this church, and I agree. This, in my lifetime, except when I was a kid growing up, I have never been in a church that's as loving and as accepting as First Covenant. And we are not perfect. If we were, I wouldn't be here, because I wouldn't fit in. But we all make mistakes. And sometimes we hurt people not even realizing that we're hurting people. And sometimes we have to realize that you might have said something to me, you didn't mean it. You were having a bad day. You were frustrated. The kids were running through the sanctuary. You know, whatever it might be. We're all fellow humans. We're gonna put our foot in our mouth at one time or another. But the third one, and this is, let me explain this to you, because this is probably the most complicated one. If we're going through the process of forgiveness, and we have seen our sin, and we see people the way God sees them, and we realize that our forgiveness can lead to salvation, and also we need to be willing to reconcile the relationship. Now, when I say that, I'm not saying that you have to be buddies with the person that hurt you. I'm not saying that you need to invite them over for dinner and have coffee with them and befriend them. But what I'm saying is, you can't let them no longer have control over your life. And if you see them on a street corner, if you see them in the grocery store, if you see them at Walmart, you can at least say hi. And let God do the rest. And sometimes reconciling the situation isn't even possible. The hurt runs too deep. The pain is too hard for you to deal with. Maybe the person has passed on. But you have to give the freedom. I realize, I maybe struggle with it today, but if I run into people that have hurt me, I still, my flight or fight instinct kicks in. And I will push a grocery cart through Walmart, and I'll see somebody I don't want to see. Because, you know, it's easier to avoid them at the moment to realize that I have to say hi. But your faith will be determined by the level of your forgiveness. And I'll be very honest with you. If you are unable to forgive people, then you have to truly question your salvation. Because the two go hand in hand. If you can't forgive, then you cannot tell yourself that you are a Christian. Because the basis of our faith is based on one principle, and that's forgiveness. And the one who deserved nothing that was done to him died on the cross making this statement: Father, forgive them. And he is the only one in history who has the right to hold a grudge. And he chose not to. And so if I'm declaring myself to be a follower or a disciple of Jesus Christ, then my responsibility is to forgive. And I always leave the door open. And I always make sure that when that old head of bitterness starts rising up again, and I remind myself I'm not worthy of God's forgiveness. But he chose to forgive me, so I'm going to forgive them. It's who we are. And the level of your faith will be determined by the level of your forgiveness. And I'll be honest with you, the people that I met with up north, I haven't talked to them again now for 4 or 5 years. But I can say with all honesty, if I ran into them today, I could honestly say that the relationship has been restored. And I can say that for just about everybody in my life right now. There's some people that I don't want to see, but I can honestly say that if I saw them, I could at least say hi. So Romans is one of those books where it's powerful, changes your life. If you went through the rest of Romans, you find out you get to the end of it, and it tells you how you should live the Christian life. And the things that should be evident in your life. And you know one of the things that they tell us? Be willing to forgive. So my challenge to you today is to be like Christ. If there's somebody in your life that you are holding on to bitterness towards, and anger to, before the end of the week is a New Year's resolution, try and find a way to forgive them. Doesn't mean that you have to do it face to face. Maybe they passed on, you just have to do it emotionally. But as a born-again believer, you have the responsibility to forgive so that you can move on to the next section in your life. I'll tell you the blessing that I received when I went up north and I forgave. There was this beautiful blonde that came into my life that gave me 2 new sons that I get to raise, and who are a blessing in my life every morning when I wake up.
Well,
Even evening. Let's close with a word of prayer this morning. Our dear Heavenly